Evening. A rain-streaked cafe in Seattle. The air is thick with the scent of roasted beans and corporate stress. Clara Whitmore, the 35-year-old CEO of a booming logistics firm, stares at her laptop. Her company is bleeding millions due to last-mile delivery failures. Experts are stumped. At the next table, a 41-year-old man in a work jacket sits with his 9-year-old daughter. He quietly draws a few lines on a paper napkin. His daughter whispers, "Dad, what are you drawing?" He replies, "A faster route." Clara hears him. She glances at that napkin, unaware this scrap of paper will soon save her company $40 million. Daniel Hayes was a man who understood the skeletal pulse of the city. At 41, his face was etched with the quiet, weary resilience of a man who spent his days navigating the jagged concrete labyrinth of Seattle. He wasn't a CEO. He didn't have a corner office with a view of the Space Needle. He was an independent delivery driver, a man whose office was the cab of an aging but perfectly maintained pickup truck. He was the person who ensured the packages reached the doors when the weather turned gray and the hills became slick with ice. He was the final link in a global chain, and he took that responsibility with a silent, ironclad pride. But Daniel's life hadn't always been measured in zip codes and delivery windows. 10 years ago, he was a star student in systems engineering at the University of Washington. He saw the world in elegant strings of logic, flow charts, and optimization patterns. He was on the path to becoming a designer of empires. He spent his nights coding and his days analyzing the fluid dynamics of supply chains. But then, life downshifted with a violent jerk. His wife, Sarah, was diagnosed with a sudden aggressive illness. The medical bills mounted like a rising tide, and the high-pressure world of corporate engineering became an impossible luxury. After Sarah passed away, Daniel made a choice that his former classmates couldn't understand. He walked away from the degree in the glass towers. He needed a job that offered absolute flexibility, a job that allowed him to be the father Lily needed. He needed to be the one at the school gate at 3 p.m., the one making pancakes on a Tuesday, and the one who never missed a science project. Being a delivery driver wasn't just a paycheck for Daniel. It was a field study in reality. While the algorithms in distant data centers calculated routes based on ideal traffic flow, Daniel felt the actual friction of the streets. He knew the specific weight of the Seattle hills, how the incline on Cherry Street slowed a heavy van by exactly 4 seconds, causing a ripple effect throughout a driver's entire shift. He knew which intersections flooded after 20 minutes of rain and which residential blocks were clogged by double-parked garbage trucks at 10 a.m. He understood that a 3-minute detour on a digital map often turned into a 20-minute catastrophe in the real world. He had become an unintentional expert on the last mile, the most expensive and chaotic part of the entire logistics industry. Lily, his 9-year-old daughter, was his constant companion after school. She was a bright, observant girl who shared her father's analytical mind. They had a sacred ritual. Every evening, after Daniel finished his final drop-off, they would go to a small, warm cafe tucked into the shadows of the tech district. Surrounded by the hum of espresso machines and the frantic clicking of laptops from young entrepreneurs, they would sit and decompress. Lily would do her homework, and Daniel would pull out a pen and a paper napkin. He would sketch out the routes he had taken that day, highlighting the bottlenecks and the ghost paths, the shortcuts and side streets that no GPS ever suggested. He treated these sketches like a journal, a way to visualize the chaos of the city and find the hidden order within it. To the people in the cafe, Daniel looked like just another tired worker in a faded canvas jacket. They saw the scuffed boots and the thermos on the table. They didn't see the engineer beneath the grease. They didn't see the man who was quietly solving the most complex problem in the city's economy while his daughter worked on her long division. Daniel was content with his invisibility. He had found a peace that the corporate world couldn't provide. But on this particular evening, the air in the cafe was charged with a different kind of energy. At the table beside them, 3 people in tailored suits were staring at a glowing laptop screen with expressions of pure, unadulterated desperation. One of them was Clara Whitmore, the CEO of North Star Logistics. She was currently staring at a map that was costing her company $40 million a year in lost time and fuel. And Daniel Hayes was about to realize that the solution she was looking for was currently resting under his coffee cup. The conversation at the next table was sharp, clinical, and increasingly frantic. Clara Whitmore leaned back in her chair, her fingers rubbing her temples. As the CEO of North Star, she had built a reputation on aggressive growth, but the last mile was the anchor dragging her company into the red. She was a woman of logic, but the logic was failing. The software keeps prioritizing the arterial corridors, Clara said, her voice a low, frustrated vibration. But the arterial corridors are where the construction is. We're losing 12 minutes per delivery in the Queen Anne district alone. Multiply that by 10,000 trucks, and we're looking at a structural collapse of our margins. The experts tell me we need to buy more vans, but we don't have the capital. We need a way to move faster with the fleet we have. We're optimized for distance, but we're being killed by time. Sonam, one of her managers, a man in his late 20s with a perfectly pressed shirt and an air of unearned certainty, sighed. We've run the simulations, Clara. We've used the highest level traffic data available from the cloud. There simply isn't another way through that zone during the peak window. The grid is locked. It's a physical impossibility. Daniel, sitting just 3 feet away, heard every word. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but his engineering brain was already firing. He looked at the map on Clara's screen. It was a beautiful, high-resolution rendering of the city, glowing with heat maps of traffic density. To the managers, it was a static data set. To Daniel, it was a living, breathing machine that was currently being driven by people who didn't understand the oil. He saw the red zones they were complaining about, but he also saw the green veins they were ignoring. He looked down at the paper napkin on his own table. He had already sketched the Queen Anne district for his own route tomorrow. He saw what they were missing. They were relying on primary logistics nodes, centralized hubs that the software assumed were the most efficient. But Daniel knew those hubs were the very reason the trucks were getting stuck. They were creating their own traffic. The software was trying to shove 10 liters of water through a 1-liter pipe. With a few quick, confident strokes of his ballpoint pen, Daniel began to redraw the logic of the district. He divided the map into cell zones rather than routes. He sketched out a decentralized drop-off pattern that utilized small, overlooked parking lots and private loading zones that he had negotiated access to over the years. He drew arrows representing microtransfers, where a large van would meet a smaller vehicle for the final 100 yards of the delivery. "Dad?" Lily whispered, leaning over to see his work. "Why are you fixing their map? You don't work for the lady in the suit. She looks mean." Daniel Mimquoy smiled, a soft, tired expression. "Just thinking, pal. It's like a puzzle. Sometimes when people look at a big problem for too long, they forget how to see the small pieces. They think the solution is a hammer when it's actually a needle." Clara Whitmore caught the movement out of the corner of her eye. She was an observer by nature. You don't become a CEO in Seattle without learning how to read a room. She saw the man in the work jacket. She saw the intense, surgical focus on his face. And then she saw the napkin. It wasn't a drawing of a flower or a car. It was a schematic. It looked like a neural network mapped onto the streets of her city. It looked like a solution. "Excuse me," Clara said, her voice cutting through the manager's argument. She turned toward Daniel, her eyes narrowing. "I didn't mean to be intrusive, but I noticed your sketch. That's the 5th and Mercer intersection, isn't it?" Daniel looked up, momentarily startled. He felt a flush of embarrassment. He was used to being the ghost, not the center of attention. "Oh, yes, it is. I was just doodling, thinking out loud." Clara didn't look convinced. She stood up and walked over to his table, her eyes fixed on the napkin. "That's a decentralized handoff pattern. You're bypassing the main hub entirely and using the alleyway on 8th as a secondary pivot point." "Why?" Daniel hesitated. He saw the manager behind Clara rolling his eyes, clearly unimpressed by the trucker's input. But he also saw the genuine, desperate curiosity in Clara's hazel eyes. He decided to give her the truth, the street truth that no algorithm could replicate. "Because your hub at 5th and Mercer is the reason you're losing 12 minutes, Daniel said, his voice gaining the resonant strength of the engineer he once was. "The software sees it as the shortest distance, but it doesn't see the school bus window between 8:15 and 8:45 a.m. It doesn't see the fact that the left turn signal only lasts 6 seconds. You're sending 10 trucks into a bottleneck that can only handle 3. You're fighting the city, ma'am. You need to flow with it. He slid the napkin toward the center of the table. If you move your hand off to the alleyway on 8th, the one behind the old bakery, you save 4 minutes of idling. And if you split the loads there, you can avoid the hill climb entirely. It's not about buying more vans. It's about not letting the vans you have sit still. You're losing $40 million because your computer doesn't know that the bakery van parks there every morning at 9. The manager laughed, a shallow, condescending sound. It can't be that simple, pal. We have millions of dollars invested in the routing AI. It accounts for every variable. You're just a driver. Daniel shrugged, leaning back. Does it account for the human variable, sir? Because I do. I drive these streets every day. Sometimes the simplest way through a forest isn't the straightest line. It's the one the animals use. You're treating the city like a machine. I'm treating it like a pulse. Clara picked up the napkin. She looked at the scrawled lines and the technical notations in the margins. She didn't see a doodle. She saw a masterpiece of ground-level intelligence. May I keep this? She asked, her voice hushed. It's just a napkin, Daniel replied with a small smile. Clara didn't answer. She tucked the napkin into her leather portfolio as if it were a multi-billion-dollar contract. The meeting at her table ended shortly after, the manager still whispering about unqualified advice. But as Clara walked out of the cafe into the rain, she didn't look at her phone. She looked at the napkin. She realized that she had been looking for a genius in a boardroom, but she had found one sitting with a 10-year-old girl and a cup of cold coffee. The next 3 months were a whirlwind of quiet experimentation inside North Star Logistics. Clara Whitmore didn't tell her board of directors about the napkin. She knew they would think she had lost her mind. Instead, she quietly directed a small team of internal analysts, the ones who weren't afraid to get their boots muddy, to run a pilot program based on the Daniel map. They started with the Queen Anne district. They moved the handoff points to the ghost zones Daniel had identified. They instructed the drivers to ignore the AI's primary routes and follow the animal paths through the side streets. At first, the results were subtle. A few minutes saved here, a gallon of fuel saved there. But then, the data began to compound. By the end of the first month, the delivery window for Queen Anne had shrunk by 15%. The drivers were less stressed. The maintenance cost for the brakes and transmissions, constantly strained by the stop-and-go arterial traffic, began to drop. One of the lead engineers, skeptical until the end, ran the numbers 3 times. Clara, this shouldn't be happening, he said. The distance traveled has actually increased by 3%, but the delivery speed has increased by 20. It defies the logic of the core algorithm. The algorithm doesn't know about school buses, Clara replied, pointing at the framed napkin on her desk. But the man who drew this did. Clara sat in her office, staring at the quarterly efficiency report. The napkin logic was working better than the $5 million software suite. She realized that the software was designed by people who saw the city as a grid, while Daniel Hayes saw it as an ecosystem. He understood the timing of the city. He understood that a route isn't just a line, it's a series of windows that open and close. The real breakthrough came during the holiday surge, the most dangerous time for a logistics firm. Usually, North Star would have to hire 200 temporary drivers and lease 50 extra vans just to keep up with the volume. But this year, using the decentralized cell strategy, they managed to handle the same volume with their existing fleet. The bottlenecking that usually caused a cascading failure of the entire system simply didn't happen. The vortex of traffic that usually swallowed their profits had been bypassed. By the end of the quarter, the chief financial officer walked into Clara's office with a look of absolute stunned disbelief. He laid a single sheet of paper on her desk. Clara, I don't know what you did with the operational oversight, the CFO said, his voice shaky, but our last mile costs have cratered. We've saved nearly $10 million in 3 months. If we scale this to the other 4 regions we operate in, we're looking at a $40 million swing in the annual budget. We're not just in the black. We're dominating the market. We're ready for the Tokyo expansion. Clara didn't celebrate. She didn't call a press conference. She reached into the top drawer of her desk and pulled out a small, clear plastic sleeve. Inside was the paper napkin from the café. It was stained with a faint ring of coffee and a smudge of graphite. "We didn't do it," Clara whispered. "The driver did." She spent the next week trying to track down the man from the café. She realized she didn't even have his last name. She went back to the café every evening at the same time, sitting at the same table, waiting for the man in the work jacket and the little girl with the sketchbook. But Daniel wasn't there. He had taken a long-distance contract to help pay for Lily's upcoming summer camp. He was out on the road hundreds of miles away, completely unaware that his doodle had become the blueprint for a corporate revolution. He was still just a dad trying to make sure the rent was paid and the truck stayed running. He was still a ghost in the system he had saved. Clara eventually used the delivery records from that Tuesday evening to find the independent driver assigned to the design district. She found his name, Daniel Hayes. She looked into his background and saw the unfinished systems engineering degree. She saw the history of Sarah's illness. She saw the man who had traded his potential for his daughter's presence. She realized then that the most valuable asset in her company wasn't the fleet or the contracts. It was the intelligence that was currently being hidden in the cab of an old pickup truck. She didn't just want to thank him. She wanted to hire the mind that saw the vortex in the traffic. She wanted the pattern seeker. As the board prepared for the annual shareholders meeting, where Clara was expected to present her genius new routing system, she made a decision. She wasn't going to take the credit. She was going to show them the napkin. She was going to show them the man behind the logic, because she realized that true leadership isn't about being the one who solves the problem. It's about being the one who is humble enough to recognize the solution when it's written on a piece of trash by a man who actually knows what he's talking about. The boardroom was a sea of expensive suits and high-status watches. The directors were leaning forward, waiting for Clara to explain how she had miraculously turned the company's biggest liability into its greatest asset. The air was thick with the scent of expectation and success. These were men who measured value in percentages and dividends, and Clara was about to give them a lesson in humility. Clara stood at the head of the table. She didn't use a PowerPoint. She didn't use a laser pointer. She simply walked to the center of the room and placed a small, framed object on the mahogany surface. It was the napkin. "This," Clara said, her voice clear and resonant, "is the reason our fourth quarter projections are up 30%. This is why we didn't have to lease a single extra vehicle during the holiday surge. And this is why we are going to save $40 million this year." The directors squinted, some of them putting on their glasses. "A napkin, Clara?" one of them asked, a hint of a sneer in his voice. "Is this a performance art piece, or has the pressure finally got to you?" "This is a master class in ground-up systems engineering," Clara countered, her eyes flashing. "It was drawn in 5 minutes by a man who understands our business better than our most expensive consultants. He understood that our software was trying to conquer the city while he knew how to cooperate with it. He found a $40 million glitch in our logic using a ballpoint pen because he actually knows what it's like to be stuck in traffic." She looked around the room, making eye contact with every person there. "We spend millions on data, but we've been ignoring the people who actually touch the product. We've been leading from the top floor, and we became blind to the ground. This napkin reminded me to look down. It reminded me that the most powerful intelligence is often sitting in a coffee shop, not a server room." "Ad conasum," the room went silent. The arrogance of the board was momentarily humbled by the simplicity of the truth. Clara then announced that she was establishing a new department, Field Intelligence and Operational Design. She informed them that the position of director would be offered to the man who drew the map. "But he's just a driver," the operations lead protested, his face turning a deep red. "He doesn't have the credentials for a director role. What will the shareholders think?" Clara looked at the man, her gaze icy. "He has 40 million credentials in his pocket, John. That's enough for me. And if he won't take the job because he wants to be with his daughter, then we'll build the job around him. Because I'd rather have a driver who knows the truth than a director who's blind to it." That afternoon, Clara drove to the address on Daniel's file. It was a modest apartment on a quiet, tree-lined street. She saw the old pickup truck in the driveway. She saw Daniel on the porch, helping Lily build a model bridge out of popsicle sticks. The pattern seeker was at work, even in his downtime. Daniel looked up as the luxury sedan pulled to the curb. He recognized Clara immediately, though he looked a bit wary. He stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Ms. Whitmore, is there a problem with the steering rack delivery? I checked the manifest." Clara walked up the steps holding her portfolio. She didn't look like a CEO today. She looked like a student. "No, Daniel, there's no problem. In fact, there hasn't been a problem in 3 months." She opened the portfolio and showed him the quarterly report. She showed him the highlighted sections on the last mile savings. And then she showed him the framed napkin. Daniel's eyes widened. He looked at the numbers, and then at the piece of paper he had almost thrown away that night. You actually used it?" "We didn't just use it, Daniel. We built the future of our company on it. You saved us $40 million. And I'm here to ask you to help us save 100 more. I'm here to offer you a seat at the table you helped build." Lily looked at her father, then at the CEO. "Dad, did you fix her whole company on one napkin?" Daniel laughed, a genuine warm sound that filled the afternoon air. He looked at his daughter and then back at Clara. He realized then that his systems engineering career wasn't over after all. It had just been waiting for a different kind of classroom. He looked at the popsicle sticks on the porch and then at the billionaire CEO. "I think I might have one more sketch in me," he said softly. The transition was handled on Daniel's terms. He didn't want the corner office, and he didn't want the 60-hour weeks. Clara created a role that allowed him to work mostly remote, focusing on high-level strategic mapping while ensuring he was still the one picking Lily up from school at 3 p.m. Daniel Hayes became the secret weapon of North Star Logistics. He was the man the engineers went to when the code couldn't solve the traffic. He taught them the Sarah lesson, that a system is only as good as the people who have to live inside it. He brought the drivers into the boardroom. He turned the final mile into a collaborative conversation between the data and the dirt. He was the architect of a new kind of company, one that valued truth over status. 1 year later, Daniel and Lily were back at the small cafe in the tech district. The city was glowing with the first lights of the evening. Daniel was wearing a clean dark sweater and a pair of professional trousers, but he still had that same calm, observant gaze. Clara walked in, joining them at their table. She looked different, too. The frantic, stressed energy of the Ice Queen had been replaced by a quiet, deep confidence. She sat down and ordered a coffee. "The board just approved the expansion into the Tokyo market," Clara said, her voice full of a quiet pride. "They want the Hayes protocol for the urban density there. They've realized that the napkin is more powerful than the mainframe. You're a legend in the boardroom, Daniel." Daniel smiled, ruffling Lily's hair. "Tokyo is a big puzzle, Clara, but the physics are the same. You just have to listen to the streets. You have to hear what the city is trying to tell you." Lily showed Clara her latest drawing. It wasn't a bridge or a car. It was a map of their neighborhood, with every house colored in a different, vibrant shade. In the center was their own house, glowing with a bright yellow sun. "It's beautiful, Lily," Clara said softly, touching the edge of the paper. "It's the most efficient way to get to the park," Lily explained with her father's logic. "If you take the path through the blue houses, you don't have to wait for the red light. Everyone gets there faster, and no one gets angry." Clara laughed and looked at Daniel. She realized then that the most important thing Daniel had taught her wasn't about fuel costs or routing tables. He had taught her that success isn't a destination you reach by climbing. It's a feeling you find when you finally learn how to walk on the ground. The story of the single dad and the CEO didn't end with a merger. It ended with a simple, honest connection. They had found the heartbeat of the city, and in doing so, they had found their own. As they walked out of the cafe into the cool Seattle night, the city hummed around them. The trucks were moving, the packages were arriving, and for the first time in years, the rhythm was perfect. Daniel Hayes wasn't a nobody in a work jacket anymore. He was the architect of the future. But to the little girl holding his hand, he was still just the man who could draw magic on a napkin. And that was the only title he would ever need. True innovation isn't found in a laboratory or a sterile office. It is found in the hands of the people who do the work every day. Never judge the value of an idea by the paper it is written on. Respect the expertise of the ground level, for they are the ones who truly understand how the world moves. If you believe that the best ideas often come from the most unexpected places, subscribe for more stories like this, and tell me in the comments, have you ever had a simple idea that solved a massive problem at your work?